Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Singapore Biennale 2025 Curatorial Contributor Talk titled "You Won't Believe What's Under This Bridge." We are delighted to welcome the Packet. Hi. A collaborative platform established in 2019 by a group of artists from Sri Lanka. It grew from just 8 artists coming together to realize an artist publication also entitled The Packet. With a particular focus on hyperlocality, the collaborative processes and conversation, the Packet functioned as a broad platform that has since embraced the work of 19 young artists in Sri Lanka to date. They work across print and digital mediums with site-specific intervention that responds to a stratified world driven by the desire to explore what it looks like to do thinking in public. Their work has been featured in the Serendipity Arts Festival, the Goethe Institute Day After Thought projects, and others. Their curatorial contribution to the Biennale, Water Under the Bridge / A Water Under Bridge, is a multimedia installation you can view at Far East Shopping Centre. It takes the familiar form of an old internet cafe, creating a powerful space for reflection and connection. So we are joined today with the members from the Packet. I'll allow Celine to introduce them soon. And we also have the artists 𝙭𝙗𝙗 and Eleanor Hunt. So please join me in welcoming Packet and the speakers.
Thank you, Marilyn. Sorry, I will do a double introduction or so, just to give a more in-depth look into what we will discuss with the Packet and their contributors. So we have like several layers of contributors here today. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for You Won't Believe What's Under This Bridge. And today with us, we have from the Packet, we have Mayun Kalu, and then we have Halik Azeez, and then between and then Imaad here with me, 𝙒𝙗𝙗𝙩𝙗, and then there is also 𝙒𝙑𝙗𝙗𝙗, who is not able to join us today, and 𝙒𝙩𝙗𝙗𝙗, who is also not able to join us today. But then in between them, there is Eleanor Hunt, and there's 𝙭𝙗𝙗𝙗, who's their artist, who's part of the project that they are initiating that's titled Water Under the Bridge, a bridge underwater. So there are two different versions of this. So for this edition of the Singapore Biennale titled Pure Intention, the Packet presents this curatorial contribution, and it's a project that's framed by two competing images. Water under the bridge suggests a form of closure, that something difficult has been already resolved and left behind. I think it's a kind of like a phrase or aphorism that most of us use in a slightly cheesy manner, but also quite well known. But a bridge underwater proposes the opposite. So the idea of a return of what was meant to be over, or a collapse of structure where the past submerges the present and futures become precarious because their histories were never truly reconciled. And so the internet cafe, as Marilyn mentions, becomes the site of this reversal. So the internet cafe, I think, for some of us of a certain vintage, we will know that like it was once a portal into a new era when the internet was a place you went to. So the cafe now slowly dissolves under the very infrastructures that it helped build, and access that was once optimistic now kind of leaks backwards as well. So in this version of the cafe that the Packet is running with us at the Far East Shopping Centre, the machines run. So the CMS, or the content management system, still streams, but the logic has shifted. So the idea of connection has given way to recursion, and history seeps through the walls and the individual cubicles of the internet cafe. So as you enter into the space, the visitors encounter a constellation of videos on distributed terminals through a custom-built YouTube-like CMS titled You Serve instead. I won't go too much into it, but I'm just tempted to say a little. So the works range from newly commissioned contributions to edited found footage, including artistic responses to the idea of bridges as infrastructure and metaphor, and early internet optimism and anxiety, and stalled developments and submerged ruins, and as well as environmental imagery that reveals cities on the brink of disappearance. So as visitors browse, what you will see is not just a static platform, but you will also encounter annotations, fragments, and comment sections, and clues that will turn your viewing experience into a pursuit or a puzzle that is not like kind of stiff. And this navigational mode, I would say, actually mirrors how we consume digital content today, not linearly, but through intuition, distraction, conspiracy logic, and algorithmic spirals. I think those of us on Instagram will know what that means. So each computer processes its own proclivities, pushing viewers into different rabbit holes and the very structure that shapes online life. And all that much said, I wanted to really just kind of highlight the fact that my colleagues at the Singapore Biennale team, the co-curators and I, were first drawn to the packet's methodologies of collaborative sampling and this kind of refusal of neat curation, a kind of spontaneous co-production and a very mischievous digital hijacking that we encountered online remotely. So even before we met in person, I think many of us followed them on Instagram and then just kept consuming their information on a daily basis in a very light-hearted manner as well, and in a rather irreverent manner. And so the work of the packet turns the logic of algorithmic consumption upside down. And it often resists a single narrative in favor of fragments and competing truths. And I remember that in early discussions, we began with the idea of a monolithic container, quite literally. But through that dialogue, we have shifted towards this form of distributed network of screens that are familiar yet dissonant, and staged through the relic-like architecture of the internet cafe. So today, I would like to invite the packet as well as their artists, Alana and 𝙑𝗡, to speak about how this project evolved and what it means for contemporary practice to be dexterous, covert, and mischievous, and why public gathering is still matters amidst this form of digital saturation as well. So please.
Thank you, Celine. Very quickly, how many of us have visited an actual internet cafe in our lives? Okay, not bad, not bad. Okay. So the internet cafe to us is an interesting space in the sense that it was, unless for a lot of people, it was perhaps the first time you really encountered the internet. And it also is just as a very older version of the internet that we would have access through it, right? And in the early 2000s, technology offered us so much promise that we were really taken up by the kind of utopianism of that, right? The whole Y2K energy at the time. Nowadays, however, you don't really need an internet cafe so much because everyone has a smartphone, everyone has access to the internet. No one hears the sound of a dial-up modem anymore. It's a sort of seamless film that seems to surround everything. We're constantly connected. Our location is constantly being tracked. And there are many ways in which the internet of today would be quite unrecognizable if you showed it to someone in the past. What's interesting also about that moment of our first encounters with the internet as it began being populated and sort of co-created by people around the world is that not just that it helped us envision what the future might be and held space for our imaginations, but it also made the past searchable in a way that was quite unprecedented. Whereas before you would have to go to a library, you would have to seek out encyclopedias, and knowledge would be distributed, in these books that are scattered across the globe. The internet eventually brought it all into one place. And this was really quite interesting to us, this sense of how it becomes a container for the past. And to us, just to get into a bit of the theme of where we arrived, the internet is also a form of infrastructure, right? The internet cafe then is this bridge that connects us from this physical plane into this cyber realm. And in doing that, we were interested in thinking about infrastructure in general and how it tends to lend to a sort of optimism, this idea that we're growing towards something, we're building towards something. But this past that is contained on the internet finds ways, finds ruptures to kind of come back into the present. It finds ways to interrupt the move towards the future. I think I'll let Halik kind of plug in from here.
Yeah, Imaad, thanks for that. I mean, I feel like also, yeah, just riffing off that in terms of the theme, I think when we were also invited, right, by you guys, I feel like it's this like story that first came into our heads, this image of Singapore that Sri Lanka's always had, right? And it's probably an apocryphal story. It doesn't probably never happened. I've never found any evidence for it, even on the internet, any sort of actual visual evidence for it. But the story is that in the 1960s or so, Lee Kuan Yew looked at Sri Lanka and said, "Hey, I want Singapore to be Sri Lanka. You know, Singapore must become like Sri Lanka." And then this has been repeated so much throughout the history of the war in Sri Lanka as a way to sort of illustrate how much we've missed out. You know, how much these years we've lost have sort of impacted us because we haven't become like Singapore. And what has happened in Sri Lanka after the war ended was exactly that effort to become like Singapore, become like Dubai, or any other sort of developed city, right? And it's literally sort of stated in one of our development agenda to make Colombo a world-class city. And this idea of like urbanity, this idea of infrastructure being a salvation has become predominant in our sort of post-war climate. And it's also, you know, put forward in a way in which to say that, oh yeah, with infrastructure, with progress, with all these sort of like aesthetic symbols of progress. And that's interesting because this writer called Brian Larkin, he writes about how infrastructure is actually a visual sort of phenomenon, fundamentally, right? One of the fundamental purposes it provides is a visual sort of idea of progress. Because a lot of these visuals, like a lot of the skyscrapers in Colombo, for instance, represent lives that most people would never be able to access. But their presence and the presence of these massive infrastructures signal this future that has arrived, but maybe it hasn't ever arrived to you, but it might, you know, and so it keeps you sort of going, keeps you sort of buying into the narrative. And I think it was really sort of like that idea. And then this, a few incidents that happened. One in particular was that, and maybe I'll touch on this briefly, there was a highway being built in Colombo to connect this, what's called the port city, which is this large reclaimed island, to the central highway that leads to the airport. And they were building this, essentially a bridge, right? It's this overhead highway. And when they were building this bridge, and as soon as they broke ground, they started discovering skeletons. And pretty soon they discovered that these skeletons were part of a mass grave. And the mass grave could have been related to either the sort of Marxist uprisings in the 70s and 80s or the Civil War. But of course, it wasn't really investigated, and the bridge sort of like kept going, right? But it's this sort of, this refusal of the city or the landscapes of people's memories to allow this future to take over. That's really interesting to us. The past keeps coming back. It keeps sort of overcoming the future in a way. So this bridge never really sort of stays above the water. The water keeps coming back. And that really became sort of like what we were interested in. And the bridge just then became the central metaphor for it. Yeah.
And then once you sit at the computers at the internet cafe, what you see before you is a website, which is our recreation, revisiting of the early era of the video sharing platforms. When there weren't sophisticated algorithms and people hadn't yet figured out this notion of what clickbait is and using, you know, thumbnails to draw people in and all of these ways in which our attention is constantly being harvested by these platforms. So we kind of designed this website as a container to kind of like instead of a white cube, right, we have these layers where you're in the internet cafe, then you're on this website, and it's showing you these playlists. If we were to count in artist contributions, there are about 100 or so videos, so you could really spend a lot of time at the cafe browsing through them. And as you can see, we've arranged them into playlists to take you through these journeys. So this presented also curatorially a bit of a challenge when we were inviting artists into the work, because not only is there the thematic of water under the bridge and bridge underwater, there's also the layout of the internet cafe that we're also inviting artists into, and then further into this website itself. What was great about using a content management system or a CMS was that it also became a place for the artists to really play with, and as they were working, creating their drafts, they would put them up on the platform, which gave us as curators a way to easily access it without having, files distributed amongst many computers and such. And it also allows the artists to see the other work as it's being developed and in some sense be in conversation as well. Yeah.
If I can also jump in, it's just also to touch on what you said earlier about the messiness of making the work. And I feel like maybe this is also where we were invited to be curatorial contributors. But I think what really ended up happening was we ended up making a collaborative art piece in a way. And so we invited artists to also think of themselves as not just like making video works, but as sort of the artwork being the profile itself. So you are actually a user entering this CMS, and it's essentially this kind of semi-fictional sort of space.
So certain artists would have perhaps one user profile or multiple. They would adopt certain personalities in order to tell their stories, which of course maybe is a good segue to get into our artists. Maybe 𝙒𝗶𝗴, if you would like to start with how you approached the fiction of your existence on the website and the story that you wanted to tell through that.
Yeah, so I guess when the packet approached me back then to contribute this, sharing with me this curatorial concept, I just thought it was quite interesting because it's also a way to curatorially, the concept is also about water under the bridge and the bridge underwater. Is also to kind of revisiting what was past and eventually what has kind of resurfaced as well. Is something that I myself have always been quite obsessed with certain archival history. So what I presented here is also with a topic that I've worked on since 2019, a topic on the rise and more of the political and cultural nuances of rice research. So with that, I actually, when they mentioned to me about the idea of the internet cafe, then I just thought what would be interesting is that, oh, why not I literally do what people used to do, or rather what I used to do in an internet cafe, which is MSN chat. So the video is pretty much really just an MSN chat, but it actually responds towards a work I've also developed earlier on as well, where I basically create this fictionalized past of Singapore, where it was based on an earlier work called If We Grew, right? So Singapore have a lot of politicians like to plant trees, right? So what I did is I used AI and a bit of my Photoshop skills to actually edit some of those photos into politicians growing rice. So what happens here is that I am creating this MSN chat with this fictional character who lives in a parallel universe in Singapore where rice is grew. And then I also was amazed in a way there's this interaction going on, a bit of like character building, world building situation, which is completely new for me. When I encounter this, have to develop this, and then eventually start sharing all these images with the person as well. And then actually at the same time as well, also a space for me to finally be able to put some of the audiovisual material that I've been working on, or rather not I've been working on, that I've been featured to put into a work, because it has always, so long story short, it's basically a local TV channel actually featured about my rice garden before. And so it has always just been in the backlog, I don't know how to feature it, and I thought this would be an interesting way to bring in something that is not fiction but real, because I do have that rice garden here in Singapore, and the local TV channel really feature it, and sharing with this fiction, this parallel universe about how rice is not grown in Singapore, and then but I actually try to grow them as for fun, as an experiment, and how this eventually develop into more and more maybe surprises, and also kind of like I mentioned, the visual materials of how there's a kind of juxtaposing as well between my AI and Photoshop images of Singapore politicians growing rice versus the real archival photos of politicians planting trees in Singapore. So, and also in a way sharing the context of the larger political visuals of how politicians actually use rice harvest or planting rice as a kind of visual propaganda as well. Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, these are the few countries that have predominantly used these visuals as a way to bring forward certain messages. So it's a lot of like, yeah, it was a very fun experience, I must say, because something that I can bring perhaps something about agriculture and food into an internet space which wouldn't have been possible if not for their curatorial concept, I would say. Maybe, Alana, you want to share about yours?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was really interested in the conceptual premise of water under the bridge, bridge under water from the start, but also the the platform itself. I think I'm particularly interested in, or I think of the art world as one space to move my work, but I really am interested in getting my work out into the world in different ways as well. And Celine, you started by saying covert, mischievous, and dexterous, and those three words like really excited me as well. My contributions to this are kind of split between two places that I've worked in Kashmir. So one is Kashmir, and I've worked there since 2009, and the other is Western Australia, where I've lived since 2011, but I really started making work there around 2017-18. So if we can go to Kashmir Reader, or Reading Kashmir. In 2010, I began a participatory memorial grounded in like conversations and cups of Kashmiri tea, nun chai, that responded to a really intense period of state violence, public mourning and protest within Kashmir that killed over 118 people. So that body of work was called Cups of Nun Chai, and I started it in 2010. In 2016 and 17, the work, which took the form of photographs and conversations that I had written down from memory from those cups of tea. So I had 2 years where I had 118 cups of tea, and with people within Australia, India, and Kashmir. And those conversations wove together a narrative of personal memories and stories of state violence and resistances to that, and the grief that runs through those things. Grounded in Kashmir, but also building a much broader, like, international narrative and connection between these places. But one thing that was really important for me was that it was serialized, the work was able to reach within Kashmir at the time that it was happening. So it actually began as a blog and was progressively uploaded on a website. But in 2016 and 17, it was serialized in a newspaper in Kashmir called Kashmir Reader. And over 11 months, 86 editions carried my work, and that was a way for me of like slipping an exhibition into the folds of a newspaper, and also reaching a really broader audience within Kashmir, one that might not normally engage with art per se. So the work began in June that year, and by October, another period of state violence had emerged and the newspaper was banned for 3 months. And then on the last day of December 2016, the ban was lifted and the newspaper resumed publishing, and the editors of the newspaper resumed the serialization of my work. So at that time, I collected physical copies of all of those newspapers that had carried my work, and I was interested in like placing my work in a newspaper for that sense of public distribution, but also the idea of my work was quite grounded in memory as a memorial, and placing it beside the news of the day was really a way of building a kind of conversation and thinking about what had changed over time and what kind of things were repeating. But so what happened, next June next year will be the 10-year anniversary of the commencement of that newspaper serialization. And I've been sort of thinking about what to do with this archive. A few years after it was serialized, most of the newspapers in Kashmir had their online archives erased, covertly, but like by the state, basically. And so the collection of newspapers that I have of Kashmir Reader have inadvertently become one of the only media archives of that moment in Kashmir's recent history. And I have them as hard copies and also digital scans. And since when the newspaper ban happened in 2016, we all knew that it was being used to make an example. But the media landscape within Kashmir now has like dramatically changed beyond recognition from a time that Kashmiri journalists were in really writing really powerful reportage, and not much can be reported in Kashmir now at all, and most people that I know are not actually working as journalists because it's not safe to do so. So that's quite a long story, but basically the platform that the packet have provided I've been thinking of ways how can I kind of safely activate these newspapers and continue to allow people to access them. And yeah, so the 𝙎𝗓𝙯 became a platform to kind of continue circulating these. And so there's nothing like, unlike your work kind of blurring the fictional and the real, these are all very real archives, and we dated them by month, and then just below you can see the days of the newspapers that were published during that period. And yeah, I think for me, like this work also, the notion of water under the bridge and something being left behind, I think that's probably what the state would like to happen to this moment in history and this newspaper. And the bridge underwater, like evoking that sense of return and this stubbornness of the persistence of this newspaper archive. The second body of work that I have here is grounded in a place where I used to live in the north of Western Australia. Just to sort of shift gears here now as well. Mostly all of my work in Australia is really rooted in trying to get non-Indigenous people to see themselves and the violence of their everyday lives within a structure of settler colonialism much more clearly. And so I've made a whole body of work over a number of years that have looked at things like leisure and tourism, legislation and development. And so I think, so I moved to this part of Australia in 2011, and I'd actually just returned from 3 years in Delhi. And I met a young intern that had been sent from India to the Kimberley, working with Rio Tinto. And this was at a time where India had launched something called Operation Green Hunt, which was like a attack on an armed Naxal kind of resistance within a mining heavy area of India. I think that's an all right way to summarize it. And so Rio Tinto had engaged a young social worker from India to come to Australia and learn about how to build community relationships on behalf of the mining company with Indigenous people in Australia, and then take that back. And that really sparked a very early seed in my mind that these systems of development and corporate extraction in different ways were happening in very localized places, but with like global connections across regions that are not often visible to us in very material ways. Anyway, so I've looked a lot at also what I would describe as like a colonial dream of development, and it sort of resonated when you were talking about the aspirations between Sri Lanka and Singapore. So my contributions here involve, I have one narrative film called Surveilling a Crime Scene, which is specifically about the town of Kununurra where I used to live. That film was like pre-existing before this initiative, and maybe it's something Halik and I, he'd seen it earlier and we'd worked around other things together. But the main contribution is what Mayun is showing on the screen now. That film, Surveilling a Crime Scene, that I made had a tiny bit of archival footage made by a man named 𝙒𝙗𝙩 that showed the explosion of a mountain in the town that I used to live in. The explosion of that mountain created a dam, and that dam seeded the township through agriculture. And I've also looked a lot at the violence of agriculture as it is used by settler colonial structures. So I realised that 𝙒𝙗𝙩 had been commissioned by the West Australian government to produce a lot of films about the state in the 60s and 70s, and they'd recently come out of copyright. So I was able to access 12 of these films, and I've edited them down, really focusing on the narration. You can't hear it now per se, if you want. Oh, this is actually the dam, yeah. Anyway, so I've actually pulled out words or phrases from the original narration and made them into these little tiles. And for me, it's a way of making more visible and drawing attention to, I think, the worldviews. And some of the words are like particularly violent, some of them are very banal, some of them are highly sexualized, some of them also comfortable living. The thread across all of these films is, and throughout my work as well, is not so much the obvious forms of colonialism, but some of the more discrete forms, and particularly running through all of these works is this constant thread of constructing home or a comfortable community. And I think that we don't often think of that in relationship to colonialism, but it's like this construction of a nice life for the settler. And that's what all of these run through. And I'll try and wrap up now because I think I'm talking too long. But it's also been great to see some other archival films on the platform from different places, but of this era as well. And yeah.
Testing. Thanks, Alana and 𝙑𝗡. I think maybe since we have gone a little bit deeper into that rabbit hole, I wanted to just bring us back to the surface a little bit more about the overarching idea of this idea of collaboration. I think I mentioned earlier in my introduction that much of the packet's work sounds like or feels like collective thinking done publicly as well. And I think through the works of 𝙑𝗡 and Alana, we do get to see that. So there's a certain kind of like messiness, but also iterative nature of your work. But I think maybe I wanted to ask all of you also, or whoever would like to take that question, but what forms of knowledge only appear when thinking becomes social rather than authored by just one person? Because I feel that for most of you, you came together because there was some form of communal speculation or watching or listening or looking together. And that kind of resists the hierarchies of curating and the kind of national narratives that would otherwise persist. So maybe you can speak a bit more about that.
Say something to that. I feel like, well, I mean, we started off actually because there were three of us living in an apartment together. So it was really this sort of community space that developed in this apartment in a city where there was very little independent spaces for artists. And what we do is we start working together. The first, the packet was originally this book that we wanted to make, and it was just the name that we gave the book because we wanted to put everything into like a paper packet, and we were gonna like find a much cooler name later on. But then the name stuck for the book, and then the name stuck for the group, which then I think now has become a collective. But what we also do is we read a lot together, and then we sort of like realize later on that, oh, this thing kind of describes us, so we're really attracted to this kind of language. So one way to maybe answer a question, Celine, is through like Morton and Hani, who speak about collective study, right? And collective study is what we do with other people. And I think that really resonated with us because that is something that reaches beyond kind of maybe academic or intellectual knowledge or knowledge that can be explicated in certain ways or produced in certain ways, but maybe knowledge that is produced purely through the act of being together and doing things together. And another thing we really like to think about is process, right? And maybe much earlier in the work we did, we were really sort of focused a lot more on, oh, what's the process? So we did this one publication called Mathematics, and it was called Mathematics because one of the participants had a maths teacher who said, oh, I'm not interested in results, I just want to know how you got there. So it's really about the workings, the process. So the book was essentially this 14 threads of emails that we wrote to each other during the pandemic. And then after the pandemic, after the lockdown was lifted, we came and edited them down. So I think this idea of thinking together in public, thinking in public is really important to us because of that kind of rawness, that the fact that it doesn't really put an onus on producing knowledge as such, as opposed to just trying to, or just trying to sort of like just explicate thought in a way, if that makes sense. And also I feel like one of the things that we wanted to do in the beginning, I feel like what we all shared was this sort of like a collective exhaustion of having to always speak to the world, right? Always being stuck in this binary where you're constantly speaking back to power. And you're then, by dint of that, you're always stuck in the language of power. You can't kind of exit that dialectic, right? And so also as practicing artists, also from the global south, there is this sense that, oh, you're kind of pigeonholed into almost like an area studies spectrum in sometimes. And you're maybe also required to speak about certain topics through certain emotional registers. And I feel like we were trying to resist that. And we asked, but one thing we say in our bio is, what does it mean to speak from as opposed to speak to? And it's that idea of like, oh, speaking from to us means just being playful. Just maybe sort of like having an Instagram feed where it's just a whole bunch of shit posts. It's basically TikToks that are posted again and again and again. And is that knowledge production? Maybe, maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know what kind of knowledge production it is, but I think there's something there, I feel like.
Yeah, and even that modality of Sandev likes to make this joke that our whole process is taking stuff from one platform and putting it onto another platform, and then somehow something magical happens in that. But really, we started our Instagram account because we wanted to build up an audience so that when our first book was ready, we'd be able to get it out there. And the book took forever to get produced because a lot of things happened. There were the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka, and then COVID, and eventually the financial collapse. But while we were trying to build the audience, we would just, all of us had access to the same Instagram account, so we would just like post stuff. And eventually we realized we had no idea who was posting what, but there would be these weird threads of connection across these seemingly random posts and videos, and we just kind of started leaning into that. And you simultaneously wanted to know who it was who started the conversation, but you also really liked it being a mystery. So even today, like, no one really knows who's posting on the packet. It just kind of happens, and somehow a conversation is built. But um, we kind of discovered this form of like, yeah, you can connect these different TikToks together and then have like screenshots from the book that you're reading, and it becomes this like contemporary way of not just helping people unpack an idea, but for us to be in conversation with each other and thinking in public in that sense, yeah.
And I think, yeah, sorry.
And that sense of it not being pinned down to a specific member of the packet also gives us more freedom. Collectively, we are freer to express things than we would be individually. So that definitely gives you more courage to kind of, say something in an exploratory way as opposed to having a definite stance or definite understanding.
I mean, it gives a bit of relief within the community, within the collective, so you can, for a change, not be serious or not be so self-conscious about what you're saying. But I just want to also add that I think it also leads into a broader community of people we've worked with and continue to work with, right? Like, I think 𝙑𝗡, Alana, 𝙒𝙑𝙪, who's here, by the way, and whose films on Margarita and coal mining in Assam are also on the platform. And the other artists we've worked with have also been like people who have shared common affinities. Alana was running this great program called Regional Arts Australia, which kind of thought about many of the same ideas. And that's really how we began to really engage meaningfully a couple of years ago. So it's also started to kind of foster this broader community of like people outside of Sri Lanka, within the region, that's actually been really enriching, yeah. And maybe that's also part of our curatorial strategy, I feel like, is friendship as well. And that's really interesting because Saurabh Hura, who is also on the platform, curated a show at the 𝙭Foundation in 2020 or 21, was it? And that show was essentially called Growing Like a Tree, and that was based around this idea of a network of friendships. So that was, I think, the central curatorial thought in that. And that was, I think, also quite striking for us. He included us in it, Alana was a part of it, and I think that's also become really a central sort of like thematic for us, this idea of connection and community in relation to sort of how we also think about curation. I mean, maybe that's just my opinion, but I really feel that.
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe in response to that, it might be also helpful for some of the audiences here where I recall a little bit more about pure intention and the curator's intention of having that as a thematic and how it relates to our eventual invitation for the packet and your contributors to join us for this Biennale. So I think when the curators were, which comprises of Duncan, Fangzi, Kim and myself, we were thinking about the thematic or how to approach the Biennale. Of course, I think as with every Biennale, everyone always tries to put the city as a proposition, right? The city as the heart of it all. But in Singapore, I think the intensity of the conditions here runs quite differently. So I think Halik made the reference of our previous like senior Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew mentioning about this relation between comparisons between Sri Lanka and Singapore, and then of course when you're when your own president absconded, he came here. And like, so there are a lot of relationships between both countries, but I would say that for us, the Biennales as a format are often very global and global symptoms of the art world. But in Singapore, I think how I often speak about the Biennale is that it plays a very deeply local role. And I want to also kind of point towards the fact that internet cafes actually invite a recurring visit. So I think the CMS as a platform eventually became fascinating even for a Singaporean like myself because of course you can read and see and browse the internet in the comfort of your own home, but like I mentioned earlier, the idea of the internet as a place to go to, a physical place, and to return to it again and again also points towards the fact that I think this Biennale hopes to really kind of speak to local audiences and not just the passing international audience that flies in and hopes to see the Biennale in like half a day or so. So I think that for us, it's also inviting people to return back to the content again, and that's where the rabbit holes as a form of like almost like as not just a artificial way of navigation, but almost as a civic condition. You know, the idea that you are asked to dive deeper into other forms of thinking. And I think that that's something that we had really admired from your work, but also wanted to, you know, borrow from your methodologies for the Biennale as well. But that said, I think I really wanted to, maybe we can get Mayun to answer this one. So I want to return us back to the idea of bridges, right? Because Halik's earlier kind of anecdote about that bridge that was supposed to connect between was it the airport and the port city and yeah, the airport. And so in that sense, the bridge here is both used as a symbol of promise, but also ruin, because I know the very iconic image that you use in your Instagram for this project is the bridge getting washed away by the water. So I think I want to also kind of ask, I mean, for the sake of audiences here as well, I think I'm a bit sheepish in also saying that it's not like we always keep in touch with how civic conditions are in Sri Lanka and how you work, right? So I wanted to also bring us back to how artists, or maybe just, you know, people of our generation and our age, like how do you all negotiate the tensions between this idea of like promised futures and a certain kind of decay, whether it's infrastructural or, you know, all sorts, I guess, and how, you know, how do you navigate that kind of tension as well? Because I think in Singapore, again, sorry to caveat really hard, but like in Singapore, the kind of tension that we navigate is a lot more subtle. Everything here is always spoken about in such sleek ways. So I think I mentioned before that for us, this Biennale is a way for the 4 curators to invite artists to think through how do we live meaningfully within systems that are built to be efficient. And like for us, it's always about trying to in our minds like dismantle that efficiency and to make ourselves uncomfortable a little bit more. But for yourselves, you know, the presence of both is very palpable.
That's a great question. I think, so just to kind of reiterate what you're asking is how we contend with maybe the market forces as well as the asks of the art world.
Yes.
And then also like our way of practicing and how those two things meet and don't meet. I was thinking earlier when you were speaking about our process, I think oftentimes whenever we meet, the first things we say is, I don't know. That's kind of where we start from, right? And for me at least, kind of the primary kind of gesture or through line for us is always starting from this place of one we don't know, in some sense of what we're doing, in the sense of like what might be the end of something, and at the same time also in the ways in which we're choosing to collaborate for each project, for each invitation. So I think each one has its own flavor and own like way of being approached. But in terms of contending, we also came together, and just to give some solid examples of what we mean when we say how we came together, it also might have sounded we're just on Instagram all the time, which is true, but we also came together to cook, and then over these meals we were just kind of complaining about some of the ongoings-ons of the art scene in Sri Lanka, as well as the funding available to us and different modes of being able to use that, right? So that was one. And I think it's just kind of, one for me is just owning that messiness, not knowing, this is, I would say, more than a conversation, an argument we have, which is, being clear about what we do and how we approach things. I think we kind of know how we work in that kind of messiness, in that kind of like figuring out through certain lenses, certain ideas and thoughts and ways of working that we gravitate towards. But we really don't know what we're going to be doing after this project in a lot of ways. We really don't. And I think that kind of keeps us going. Yeah, what do you think?
So the early conversations actually, so Halik, Sandev, and 𝙤𝙩𝙀 were living in this apartment in 𝙬𝙗𝙗 and would host fellow like friends and artists, and there was a arts festival happening in January of that year, right? And so you had other artists from South Asia as well who were here. And Sri Lanka is sort of strategic. Sri Lanka and Nepal are strategic locations for arts festivals in South Asia because Indians and Pakistanis can meet each other in Sri Lanka and Nepal, because otherwise they can't go into each other's regions. And so we were finding that in these conversations with the other artists that we all had a lot of similar frustrations. And one thing that we identified that kind of also informs us taking the stance of speaking from is that as people from the global south or people of color, we always have this burden of context where a person without color doesn't necessarily need to give you so much context as to why am I talking about this or how does this affect me. Whereas when you are from the majority population, you have to constantly educate, you have to constantly substantiate that this happened, this happened, this happened, give a whole history lesson and then be like, and that's why I feel like this. And what would it mean then to kind of reject that notion of I need to educate you, and instead just go into this is how I feel, this is what I'm speaking from, and to kind of give, not wait for the art world to give us that dignity, but to like take it really, and it's also that curation and the way that it works, which is something that this is maybe the second exhibition really that we've curated together. And I feel like we have a bit of a different approach to how it generally works, is that as artists at that point back in 2019, we all felt that our work was constantly being pushed and pulled by market forces, by curatorial invitations and such, in ways that didn't necessarily allow us to just kind of create the work that our bodies needed. For me, always, like, my first audience is myself. I needed something to be expressed, and so I do it. And if that resonates with others, that's great because you find community through that. However, and so our first project was really about, okay, if we ignore the art world circuit and like the popular conversations and all of that, together, what would we just want to make for ourselves? And that's kind of how we started, and that's what we're trying to continue to do, to not over-determine things, I would say, yeah.
I'd like to also ask Alana and 𝙑𝗶 how they feel about this as well, because we've had a lot of conversations about this, and there's also something we do. I mean, this morning as well, we were chatting about what it means to make work today.
How do you rate the packet?
Well, I think, as you guys were speaking of the earlier question, I think it was through Sorab's Growing Like a Tree that I first heard about the packet actually, and Halik and I had met, and later Mayun and I also met, but I had followed their Instagram, and every time the Instagram kept coming up, I could feel myself smirking because I would look at it, it would make me laugh, you know, but it also had a stronger discursive quality and politics, and I think it's. You know, you spoke about relationships being at the source of that, and I feel relationships are at the source of all of the work I do, but it has meant knowing your work, the sensibilities that I think do come across in your Instagram, even if it is it's playful and it's absurd and it's you know, covert, mischievous and dexterous, but it has meant, I think when we do meet in person like here, it's almost like there's a common ground between us, even though I'm not physically around you guys, and it's been great the last few days, yeah, spending time together and letting ideas flow and seeing other works in the Biennale and all of us speaking about it, and definitely those relationships and the knowledge is growing through all of that.
Yeah, I think, for me, how I got to know the packet is probably through Sandeep when he was doing a residency here at the Singapore Art Museum some years back as well. So, I think it was also, as usual, it's always through over a meal, I got to know each other, and then the next thing I know is okay, I got an email from the packet and saying, oh, you know, I want to reach out for this particular exhibition that we did in Goa back in 2023 at the 𝙬𝙬 Arts Festival. But also at the same time, you know, going back to how your platform, you know, is also, to be honest, when I first saw you guys' Instagram page, I won't realize that it's actually an arts collective, because you guys are sharing so many different, very interesting content that it feels more like maybe a portal for me to really see Sri Lanka from a Sri Lankan's eye, you know, because it's something that you know, a lot of us, even though we are living in a very globalized world today, you know, we tend to see it with different perspective, and not from the locals' perspective, and then also given all of your respective practices, background, you know, some are in institutions, some are just, you know, independent artists, you know, it really creates this kind of harmony that I find we definitely resonate a lot in our conversations. And with that is also how I think I find that that safe space that we can really communicate carefully the certain ideas, and how so far all the curatorial concepts that you all have been pitching has been really intriguing. I would say that can definitely relate to, and you know, push, especially I would say help to push my boundaries into what work I can really be doing, because in the last few years I've also made a bit of a breakthrough in terms of what I can pursue with all your challenges that you put up for me, and yeah, I guess.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I also wanted to just kind of open the floor to the room to see if you have any questions for any of the packet members, or Alana or 𝙑𝗶 as well.
Thanks for the talk, everyone. Just want to ask the packet, how do you actually gather the artists or the people on a project? Maybe can tell us about what are your methods or processes? Thank you.
Yeah, I think with each project, this also goes back into maybe the earlier question, which is we first ask ourselves, I think we have kind of 2 or 3 questions with each invitation, which is like, what are we most bothered by right now? Like what's going on in the world, or what's going on within ourselves that's really firing us up. And then also things that we are interested in, desiring and following. And just a quick caveat was with this project, especially around the same time of the invitation, we were doing these video essay nights instead of movie nights, where we were sharing video essays as a form. We thought it was a really interesting form on YouTube, especially on video platforms, different kinds of video essays. And then I think as the kind of the research and the concept kind of developed and we got into this thematics of bridge underwater, water under the bridge, I think we just looked around and then asked the same question instead, which is like, who are friends, who are parts of our network of this tree that would be amazing for this project, both in terms of who would be a great fit, but also will be a good contrast, a different flavor, a different tone, and then kind of like looked around. And I think this time we made a very long list also. So it's always a mix of like friends we worked with, friends we know, but also like collaborators or artists and researchers who we would love to work with. We had a whole combination of that, but.
Yeah, again, back to what Halik was saying, I think ideally the goal is that by the end of working together on a project that we remain friends. I think so long as we accomplish that or the friendship advances in some way, then I think we do a good job so that we can continue to be in conversation with these artists. Yeah, and we were fortunate in that everyone we approached in the end said yes and were quite excited and so far seem happy with how the process has gone. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can also kind of add on. But before that, any other questions? Maybe just one more at the back. I think we have a lot to say, it feels.
Firstly, I wanted to share that I guess the space, when you're in a private space with those wooden boards, there's a kind of sincerity as a viewer and a vulnerability, because watching these videos, you explore all kinds of emotions, from fear when you see the propaganda videos to joy when you see Beyonce's video on it, or educational. But it's really like you go through a lot of emotions in a very short period of time. And I think there's also this conception that the creator who's put the video is as sincere as you are as a viewer. So you go in very much believing whatever is shown to you. Like Anisha's video on the chair yoga, you go in so vulnerable to all of these ideas. I really enjoyed the work for that particular reason also. And my question is, now that the Biennale is going to go on for another almost 4 months, how do you see the space transforming? Because while I was there and I saw already the scribbles, I don't know if the scribbles were there when you'd already installed the work or if it was the different visitors. I too felt like leaving a mark that I was here, just to add to that, add a layer to that story. And how do you have any ideas, or do you want this space to transform in a particular way in its physicality?
So the CMS itself has invitations for viewers to comment on the videos. So what we've encouraged the artists to do is to kind of comment on each other's videos and to sort of seed the conversations that happen on the CMS level. And we took a similar sort of seeding approach with the internet cafe as well. So some of it, 𝙒𝗪𝗪 actually had quite some fun with a few of the additions, and then I put one up. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I would love to see it transform in that way.
Yeah, I think another common thing we've also especially the previous few festival focus works we've done, we've been introduced in so many different ways, as installations, as cultural, as activations. For me, it's thinking of it as, I think again, our process interfacing with the rest of the world and whoever comes in and through the space. So in that sense, I'm really happy that this work has so much layers and levels of engaging with it. If you just want to carve the initials of you and your partner onto one of the tables and leave, that's also fine. but you can also leave a comment. You can look at the artist. You can go through multiple rabbit holes. I know we went through, like, I think every single play. That's a lot. Even I haven't been through all the playlists, to be honest. So, I think I'm really happy about that different levels of interfacing that's possible with this.
Thank you. Maybe I will just want to wrap up this talk with all of them by just adding on to that point, because I noticed earlier that Imaad described this as an exhibition, which I think I found that really like, like it was a bit of a glitch in my system of thinking about working with the packet and your contributors, because I remember when we when we spoke about the project, we always mentioned about how Mayun mentioned about how actually he doesn't really know how to code or program, even though like he's in charge of this, like managing the CMS, right? And so it really just does tell you quite a bit about how there is a certain kind of honesty and a certain kind of earnestness with the packet's way of working and practicing, because I always feel that it's always very tempting to enter into, staging a work, to be able to make it completely sleek and beautiful and just without any forms of, the seams fraying, being shown to the audience. But I think that for the packet, the idea of, like I said earlier, the rabbit hole as a civic condition, or the idea of the seams that are fraying at the edges as a kind of civic condition as well is deeply important. This is what I gather from, having spoken with just looking through your work and thinking alongside you, and having that privilege to do so. So I always feel that, for us, this project, as an audience, I always feel that you have brought us to a sweet spot, like of building this platform, the CMS, where you gather everyone's thoughts, but at the same time, you also kind of like let us touch the walls of, touch the edges of where we're at, so that you get to understand the contours of a space as well. So I realized this, that audiences or visitors to new things always kind of need a bit of both. Like they need a form of guidance, that's why the playlist exists. But at the same time, once they enter into it, they also want autonomy and agency of their own. They don't want to feel like it is this kind of like one static site where they have to just plot on based on your idea of things or your concept of things. And I mean, I would like to say that on behalf of the curators for the Biennale, we are deeply, we really admire the way that you work and practice. And I think that we hope that by the invitation for the packet to be a part of the Biennale, it is also our way of also borrowing from the energy of your methodologies. And we also hope that as you join us for the talk today, that you will already have the chance, or perhaps this afternoon, make a trip to 𝙧𝗪𝗡 shopping center, and all the best in finding the unit. Like, so we've had some people got like truly lost because they really walked past the unit thinking that it was actually an internet cafe and this was not the work they were looking for. But it's, I think the entire, being within the atmosphere of 𝙧𝗪𝗡 shopping center is also quite fascinating. And we hope that you will really fall into the rabbit holes that the packet has created for us this Biennale. So, and before I end, I just wanted to also thank my colleague Marilyn and her team from the Curatorial Programs team for really putting everything together, Erica as well, who's here, and for really just taking us through all the different, visiting artists and curatorial contributors who have made time to join us for the opening of the Biennale. So thank you everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
No, sorry. I just want to also thank you, Celine and Duncan, and I think it's also like what we also wanted to mention was that doing something like this is always messy, right? It's a messy process, even though it might sometimes look very put together. And also on the note of coding, Manuja, who is our coder, actually, who has also worked with us in previous occasions as an artist, was immensely helpful. So I feel like you gave us a lot of faith in giving us this opportunity, and like also it's also the conversations we had and the back and forth, and so I really feel like we also grew a lot as a collective, and so we really appreciate you for giving us the space and for having us here, and also everyone who took a risk with us and participated in this. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.